What if the earliest myths weren't stories at all, but memories? What if the legends told by ancient cultures of gods, golden ages, floods, and forgotten realms are actually clues left behind by the first civilization? Think about it for a moment. Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, tells stories that sound impossibly similar. They speak of a time before time when the world was different, when knowledge came from somewhere else, when beings who were not quite human walked among us and taught us things we could not have learned on our own. These stories have been dismissed as fantasy, as primitive attempts to explain a world that ancient people couldn't understand. But what if we've been looking at them wrong? What if these myths aren't explanations at all, but rather descriptions? What if they're the last surviving fragments of something real, a civilization so old that it exists now only in the shape of stories, passed down through generations like heirlooms wrapped in metaphor? Tonight, we're going to explore that possibility. We're going to walk through the world's oldest myths and look for patterns, for clues, for echoes of something that might have been. We're going to ask whether humanity's first stories might actually be humanity's oldest memories. Memories of a world that came before ours, a world that vanished so completely that all we have left are whispers. And those whispers, they're everywhere. Long before Greece, before Rome, before the pyramids rose from the desert sand, there were stories. Stories older than writing itself, carried forward in the voices of storytellers who sat by fires and spoke of times their grandparents could barely remember. In ancient Sumer, in the land between two rivers where civilization is said to have begun, the people told of the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood. These weren't ordinary men. They were described as beings of immense wisdom, sent by the god Enki to teach humanity the foundations of civilization. They taught writing, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, and the arts of building cities. They appeared when humanity was still primitive, still wandering, and they transformed everything. The Sumerians were specific about this. These weren't gods in the distant sense, they were teachers, physical beings who walked among people and showed them how to live in a new way. And then, according to the myths, they disappeared. The flood came, the world changed, and the Apkallu were gone. But their knowledge remained, encoded in the practices and traditions of the people they had taught. Thousands of miles away, in the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians told a similar story. They spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an age when gods walked the earth and established the principles of Mat, the cosmic order that would govern all things. During this golden age, the god Thoth descended and gave humanity writing, medicine, astronomy, and sacred geometry. The Egyptians believed their entire civilization was built on the foundation laid during this mythical epoch, a time so ancient that even their oldest dynasties considered it distant history. The Egyptians didn't see themselves as the inventors of their knowledge. They saw themselves as inheritors, as custodians of wisdom that had been given to them by beings who came before. Their temples weren't just places of worship, they were repositories of ancient knowledge, designed to preserve what the first time had revealed. Cross the world to the Indus Valley, and you find the Vedic traditions of ancient India speaking of the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, who appeared at the beginning of each cosmic cycle to preserve and transmit knowledge. These sages were said to have survived the destruction of previous worlds, carrying forward the wisdom of ages past into the new age. They taught the Vedas, the sacred texts that contain not just spiritual teachings, but also sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, and descriptions of cosmic cycles spanning millions of years. The Vedic texts speak of yugas, vast epochs of time during which civilizations rise and fall, knowledge is gained and lost, and the world itself goes through cycles of creation and destruction. According to these traditions, we are not the first civilization. We are simply the latest in a long chain of human societies that have flourished and faded, each one leaving traces for the next. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and the Aztec told of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god king who came from across the sea to teach the people agriculture, astronomy, writing, and the calendar. He was described as a bearded figure, unusual in a land where beards were rare, and he brought with him knowledge that transformed the scattered tribes into a sophisticated civilization. When his work was done, he departed, promising to return one day. The Inca of South America spoke of Viracocha, a creator god who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great flood and travelled the land teaching the survivors how to rebuild. He showed them how to farm, how to build, how to organize society, and like Quetzalcoatl, when his mission was complete, he walked into the ocean and disappeared. Even in the most isolated corners of the world these stories appear. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose oral traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, possibly the oldest continuous culture on Earth, speak of the Dreamtime, an epoch when ancestral beings shaped the land and established the laws that would govern all life. These weren't abstract spirits. The stories described them with specificity as beings who walked particular paths, created specific landmarks, and taught the people how to live in harmony with the world around them. What's striking about all these myths is not just their similarity, but their insistence. These cultures didn't present these stories as allegories or moral tales. They presented them as history, as fact, as the explanation for where their knowledge came from and why their civilizations existed in the first place. And they all share a common thread. Knowledge came from elsewhere, from beings who were here before, from teachers who appeared, transformed everything, and then vanished, leaving behind only their gifts and the stories of their presence. Could these myths be describing the same thing? Could they be fragmented memories of an earlier civilization, one advanced enough to travel, to teach, to leave an impression so profound that it echoed through millennia? Or are we simply seeing the human mind's tendency to create similar stories when faced with similar questions about origins and meaning? The conventional answer is the latter. Scholars have long argued that these myths arise independently because all human cultures face the same fundamental mysteries. Where did we come from? How did we learn to survive? Why do we have knowledge that seems beyond what we should have discovered on our own? And so, the argument goes, we invented teachers, gods and sages and culture heroes to fill the gap in our understanding. But that explanation, while reasonable, doesn't quite account for the specificity. It doesn't explain why so many of these myths describe beings coming from the sea, or from the sky, or from a land that was destroyed. It doesn't explain why they so often speak of a time before a great catastrophe, a golden age that ended in flood or fire or darkness. And it doesn't explain why these stories, told by people who had no contact with each other, sound less like independent inventions and more like different versions of the same memory. If myths are memories, then the patterns within them might be the most important clues we have. And when you look at the world's oldest stories, certain themes appear again and again, crossing cultures and continents with an eerie consistency. The most universal of these is the flood. Nearly every ancient culture on Earth has a flood myth. The story of Noah and the Ark is perhaps the most famous in the Western world, but it's far from unique. The Sumerians told of Utnapishtim, who survived a divine flood by building a great boat and filling it with animals and seeds. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion, who survived a deluge sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth of a corrupt humanity. In India, the Matsya Purana describes how Manu was warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu about a coming flood and instructed to build a vessel to preserve life. The Chinese have the story of Gunyu, who fought against the great floods that threatened to destroy civilization. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed by water in a previous age. The Mapuche people of South America tell of a battle between two serpents that caused the sea to overflow and drown the land. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of a time when the seas rose and swallowed the coastal plains, forcing the people to retreat to higher ground. These aren't vague references to rain or storms. They describe world-altering floods, catastrophic events that reshaped the land and nearly wiped out humanity. And in many of these stories, a few survivors are warned in advance, given time to prepare, and tasked with preserving knowledge and life so that civilization can begin again. For a long time, these stories were dismissed as myth, dramatic exaggerations of local floods, or symbolic tales about moral cleansing. But then geology began to reveal something interesting. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, the world underwent dramatic climate change. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. Sea levels rose, not gradually but in pulses, sometimes catastrophically. Coastlines that had been home to human populations for thousands of years were swallowed by the ocean. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the waves. This wasn't a single event. It happened over centuries, with periods of rapid change punctuated by relative stability. But for the people living through it, the experience would have been devastating. Imagine watching the sea advance year after year, swallowing the lands where your ancestors had lived, forcing you to move again and again, always retreating, always losing ground. If there were coastal civilizations during this time, settlements along the shores of continents that are now underwater, they would have been erased. Their cities, their monuments, their entire way of life would have been consumed by the rising seas, leaving almost no trace, and the survivors, the ones who made it to higher ground, would have carried with them the memory of what was lost. Could the flood myths be describing this? Could they be the cultural memory of a real catastrophe, preserved through generations of storytelling until the specific details faded but the essential truth remained? The timing is suggestive. Many of these myths speak of a time before history, a golden age that ended in disaster, and 12,000 years ago is precisely the boundary where human history becomes murky, where the archaeological record thins out, where we lose track of what our ancestors were doing and where they were living. But the flood is just one theme. There are others, equally persistent, equally strange. Many cultures speak of sky gods, beings who came from above, who descended from the heavens to interact with humanity. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were described as gods who came down from the sky. In Egypt, the gods were associated with the stars, particularly Sirius and Orion. The Dogon people of Mali have detailed astronomical knowledge about Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, which they claim was taught to them by beings who came from that star system. In South America, the Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs carved into the desert floor, can only be fully appreciated from the air. Why would a culture without flight create images designed to be seen from above? The conventional explanation is that they were meant for the gods, for the sky beings who watched from on high. But that raises another question. Why were so many ancient cultures obsessed with the sky? Why did they build monuments aligned with celestial events? Why did they track the stars with such precision? Then there are the stories of lost continents. Plato wrote of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophe. He claimed the story came from Egyptian priests who said it happened 9,000 years before Plato's time, which would place it right around the end of the Ice Age. The Hindus spoke of Kumari Kandam, a lost continent in the Indian Ocean that was swallowed by the sea. The Japanese have legends of Mu, a Pacific civilization that disappeared beneath the waves. Are these pure fantasy? Or are they distorted memories of real places, coastal lands and islands that were lost when the seas rose, their stories growing more mythical with each retelling until they became legends of magical continents and advanced civilizations? Another recurring theme is the culture hero, the figure who brings fire or agriculture or writing or some other crucial element of civilization. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Oans in Babylonian myth emerged from the sea to teach the people the arts of civilization. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the rainbow serpent, who shaped the land and taught the people the laws they needed to survive. These figures are always described as coming from elsewhere. They're not born into the culture they transform, They arrive, they teach, and then they leave. It's as if the myths are trying to explain a sudden leap in knowledge, a moment when everything changed and people couldn't quite account for how it happened. And then there are the cycles. Many ancient cultures believed that time was not linear but circular, that civilizations rose and fell in great cycles, that the world itself was destroyed and reborn again and again. The Hindus measured time in kalpas and yugas, vast epochs during which the universe went through phases of creation, preservation and destruction. The Maya had their long count calendar, tracking cycles of time that spanned thousands of years. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds, each one destroyed when humanity became corrupt, with a few survivors carrying forward into the next age. Why would so many cultures independently develop the idea that we are not the first, that there were others before us, and that their worlds ended in catastrophe? Perhaps because they remembered. Perhaps because somewhere in the deep past there was a civilization that did fall, that did vanish, and the survivors told their children, who told their children, who told their children, until the story became myth. But the truth at its core remained. For most of history, myths were just myths. They were stories, nothing more. Colourful tales that ancient people told to explain a world they didn't understand. But in recent decades, something has changed. Science has begun to reveal that the world our ancestors lived in was far more dramatic, far more unstable than we ever imagined. And some of those myths, they're starting to look less like fantasy and more like memory. The end of the last ice age was not a gentle transition. It was a period of violent climate upheaval that reshaped the entire planet. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was warming, the ice sheets were retreating, and then something happened. The warming stopped. Temperatures plunged back into near-glacial conditions in an event called the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower that suddenly reappeared in the fossil record across Europe. For more than 1,000 years, the world was locked in this cold snap, and then, just as suddenly, it ended. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures shot up again, rising faster than at almost any other point in the geological record. The ice sheets collapsed, meltwater poured into the oceans, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet over the course of centuries, and in some cases much faster. There's evidence of massive flooding events during this period. The Black Sea, for instance, was once a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean. Then, around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus Strait in what must have been a catastrophic flood, turning the lake into a sea and drowning the settlements along its shores. Underwater archaeologists have found evidence of these lost communities, preserved beneath the waves. In North America, there's evidence of enormous floods caused by the sudden draining of glacial lakes. Lake Agassiz, a massive body of water held back by ice dams, periodically burst through its barriers and sent unimaginable volumes of water rushing toward the ocean. These floods would have been visible for hundreds of miles, reshaping landscapes in a matter of days. The Persian Gulf was once a river valley, a fertile lowland where people could have lived and thrived. When the seas rose, it was inundated, becoming the body of water we know today. The same thing happened to the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, a vast expanse of land that connected the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. It's now underwater, but during the Ice Age, it was dry land, and almost certainly inhabited. If there were settlements on these coastal plains, they're gone now. The archaeological evidence would be buried under hundreds of feet of water and sediment, almost impossible to find. But the people who lived there wouldn't have disappeared entirely. Some of them would have survived, retreating inland as the waters advanced, carrying with them the memory of what they had lost. Could this be the source of the flood myths? Not a single global deluge, but a series of regional catastrophes spread across centuries, each one devastating to the people who experienced it, each one remembered and retold until the stories merged into a universal narrative of a world destroyed by water. The timing fits. The flood myths speak of a time before recorded history, and the end of the Ice Age is precisely that boundary, the point where human civilization as we know it begins, but where the previous chapter is almost entirely lost to us. But there's more. The Younger Dryas itself is a mystery. What caused the sudden return to cold? One theory is that a comet or asteroid impact triggered the event, throwing up debris that blocked the sun and plunged the world into a deep freeze. There's evidence of a widespread layer of carbon-rich sediment from this period, suggesting massive wildfires. There are also microscopic diamonds and other materials that form under extreme heat and pressure, consistent with an impact event. If this theory is correct, and it's still debated, then the myths of fire from the sky, of stars falling to earth, of the world being consumed by flames, might not be symbolic at all. They might be descriptions of what people actually saw. The Hopi speak of the previous world being destroyed by fire. The Norse myths describe Ragnarok, a cataclysm of fire and flood that ends the age of gods. The Zoroastrians believed the world would be purified by fire at the end of time. Are these just apocalyptic fantasies, or are they echoes of something that really happened? And then there are the megaliths. All over the world there are ancient stone structures that predate the civilizations we know. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 11,600 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, is a massive complex of carved pillars arranged in circles, created by people who supposedly hadn't even invented agriculture yet. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE for reasons we don't understand. In Malta, there are temple complexes that date back more than 5,000 years, built with precision stonework that rivals anything in Egypt. In Peru, there are walls made of stone so perfectly fitted that you can't slide a knife blade between them, and no one knows how they were constructed. On Easter Island, hundreds of massive stone heads stare out at the sea, carved by a people who had no metal tools and no written language. These structures don't fit neatly into our narrative of human progress. They suggest that ancient people were capable of far more than we've given them credit for. And they raise a question. If these are the monuments that survived, what else might have existed that didn't? Stone lasts. Wood, mud brick, fabric. These decay. If there were civilizations that built primarily with organic materials, almost nothing would remain after 10,000 years. We would find only the stone, the bones, the pottery, fragments of a larger picture that we can barely reconstruct. And, if those civilizations were coastal, if they thrived on the shores of continents that are now underwater, we might never find them at all. But myths don't just describe events, they encode knowledge. And when you look closely at the world's oldest stories, you start to notice something strange. They contain information that ancient people shouldn't have had. Take the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which causes the position of the stars to shift over time. It takes roughly 26,000 years for the cycle to complete, which means the changes are almost imperceptible within a human lifetime. You would need to observe the sky carefully for centuries, comparing records across generations to even notice it was happening. And yet, ancient cultures knew about it. The Egyptians encoded precession into their mythology. The age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, these weren't just astrological concepts. They reflected the actual shift of the constellations over millennia. The Sphinx, some researchers argue, may have originally been carved to face the constellation Leo, which would date it to around 2500 BCE, thousands of years before the conventional date for its construction. The Hindu Vedas describe the yugas in terms that align with the precession cycle. The Maya tracked time in ways that suggest they understood these vast cosmic rhythms. Even the Bible contains references that some scholars interpret as encoded knowledge of precession, hidden in the symbolism of the zodiac and the ages of the patriarchs. Why would ancient people care about a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete? Why would they go to the trouble of encoding this knowledge into their myths and monuments? One possibility is that they were trying to preserve it. If you know that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost, that catastrophe can strike without warning, then you might want to create a record that can survive. But how do you do that when you don't have books, when writing is rare or non-existent, when even stone monuments can be destroyed? You encode it in stories. You weave it into myths and rituals and sacred architecture. You make it so fundamental to your culture that it gets passed down automatically, generation after generation, even if people forget why they're doing it. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with astonishing precision, more accurate than most modern buildings. Its dimensions encode mathematical constants like pi and phi. Its shafts point to specific stars that were significant in ancient Egyptian cosmology. Some researchers argue that the three pyramids of Giza are positioned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, and that the Nile represents the Milky Way in this celestial map. Is this just coincidence? Or were the builders trying to create a monument that would communicate something to future generations, a message written in stone and geometry, designed to outlast any written language? The same patterns appear elsewhere. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is aligned to the spring equinox and contains measurements that reflect cosmic cycles. The Nazca lines in Peru include geometric shapes and animal figures that some researchers believe represent constellations. Stonehenge tracks the solstices and eclipses with remarkable accuracy. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the dark. They were sophisticated astronomers, mathematicians and engineers, and they were obsessed with preserving knowledge in forms that could survive the collapse of their civilizations. But there's another layer to this. Many myths contain what appear to be technical descriptions, hidden in symbolic language. The Vedic texts describe vimanas, flying machines, in detail, including their construction and operation. The Mahabharata contains passages that sound disturbingly like descriptions of nuclear weapons, complete with blinding light, mushroom clouds, and radiation sickness. The book of Ezekiel in the Bible describes a vision of a wheeled vehicle descending from the sky, with details so specific that some engineers have attempted to reconstruct it. Ancient Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki using advanced technology, including devices that sound like genetic engineering. Are these literal descriptions, or are they metaphors for things the ancient writers didn't have words for? Phenomena they tried to describe using the only language available to them. The conventional view is that these are purely mythological, imaginative stories with no basis in reality. But that view requires us to believe that ancient people, independently and across vast distances, all happened to imagine the same kinds of advanced technology, all described it in similar ways, and all placed it in the context of a lost golden age. It's possible. The human imagination is powerful, and certain ideas might arise naturally when people contemplate what gods or advanced beings might be capable of. But it's also possible that these descriptions are garbled memories of real technology, witnessed by people who didn't understand it and tried to explain it in the only terms they had. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It's a complex geared device built around 100 BCE that could predict astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. When it was first found, no one believed it was ancient. It was too sophisticated, too advanced for the time period. It took decades of study to understand what it was and how it worked. If we hadn't found that device, we would never have known that ancient Greeks were capable of building such things. We would have assumed their technology was much more primitive than it actually was. How many other devices made of materials that don't survive might have existed and left no trace? And if a civilization from 12,000 years ago had technology that we would consider advanced, what would remain of it now? Metal corrodes, plastic degrades, electronics crumble to dust. After 10 millennia, almost nothing would survive except stone, and even stone can be weathered beyond recognition. But stories? Stories can survive anything. They can be passed down through oral tradition, adapted to new languages, transformed by new cultures, and still retain their essential core. If you wanted to preserve knowledge across a catastrophe that would destroy everything else, stories might be the most reliable medium, and that's what myths might be, the last surviving archive of a world we've forgotten. There's a tension in archaeology and anthropology, a line that most scholars are reluctant to cross. On one side is the established narrative. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, spread gradually to Egypt and the Indus Valley, and developed independently in China and the Americas. Before that, humans were hunter-gatherers, living in small bands with no cities, no writing, no complex social structures. This narrative is supported by evidence. We have the ruins of Uruk and Ur, the pyramids of Egypt, the seals of the Indus Valley. We can trace the development of writing, the domestication of plants and animals, the rise of urban centres. The story makes sense, and it's backed by decades of careful research. But it's also incomplete, and there are researchers, some credentialed, some not, who argue that we're missing a chapter, that before the civilizations we know, there was something else, something older, something more advanced, something that was lost so completely that only fragments remain. This is where the conversation becomes difficult, because once you start suggesting that there might have been an advanced civilization before recorded history, you're stepping into territory that mainstream academia considers fringe at best, pseudoscience at worst. You're lumped in with ancient alien theorists and Atlantis enthusiasts, and your ideas are dismissed without serious consideration. But what if the dismissal is premature? What if the reason we haven't found evidence of an earlier civilization is because we're not looking in the right places, or because the evidence wouldn't look like what we expect? Graham Hancock, a journalist and researcher, has spent decades arguing for what he calls a lost civilization of the Ice Age. He points to the myths, the megaliths, the astronomical knowledge, and the geological evidence of catastrophe, and suggests that there was a sophisticated culture that existed before the Younger Dryas, and was largely destroyed by it. The survivors, he argues, spread out across the world, teaching the hunter-gatherers they encountered, and seeding the civilizations that would eventually arise in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and elsewhere. This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in these early civilizations. It would explain why they all seem to have myths of teachers who came from elsewhere. It would explain the similarities in their astronomical knowledge, their architectural techniques, their symbolic systems. The mainstream response is that there's no hard evidence, no cities, no artifacts, no clear proof that such a civilization existed. And that's true. We don't have the kind of evidence that would satisfy a rigorous archaeological standard. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about a time period where most of the landscape has been radically altered by rising seas and climate change. Consider this. If our own civilization were to collapse tomorrow and sea levels rose by 300 feet, what would remain after 10,000 years? The cities on the coasts, New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, would be underwater. Most of our infrastructure would decay. Our digital records would be lost. Future archaeologists would find some stone monuments, some metal artifacts, but they would have a very incomplete picture of what we were capable of. Now imagine trying to find evidence of a civilization that existed 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower and the coastlines were completely different. Where would you even look? The places where people would have lived, the fertile river valleys, the coastal plains, are now underwater or buried under centuries of sediment. There have been some intriguing discoveries. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, underwater archaeologists have found structures that appear to be man-made, dating back thousands of years. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument is a massive rock formation that some researchers believe shows signs of human modification, though others argue it's entirely natural. In the Mediterranean, there are submerged ruins that predate known civilizations. These findings are controversial. For every researcher who sees evidence of ancient construction, there's another who sees natural geology. The debate is fierce, and the evidence is ambiguous, but the fact that we're finding anything at all in these underwater locations suggests that there's more to discover, more to understand about what existed before the seas rose. And then there's the question of why this matters. Why does it matter if there was a civilization before the ones we know? Why does it matter if myths contain memories of real events? It matters because it changes how we see ourselves. If we're the first, if civilization is only 5,000 years old, then we're at the beginning of something. We're still figuring it out, still learning, still progressing towards some future pinnacle. But if we're not the first, if there were others before us who rose and fell, then we're part of a cycle. We're not unique. We're not guaranteed to survive. The same forces that destroyed previous civilizations could destroy ours. And the knowledge that we think is permanent, that we think is safe in our books and our computers and our institutions, could be lost just as completely as the knowledge of those who came before. That's a humbling thought. And maybe that's why it's resisted. Because it's easier to believe that we're special, that we're different, that we've finally figured out how to build a civilization that will last forever. But the myths suggest otherwise. They suggest that this has all happened before, that the world has been destroyed and reborn, that knowledge has been lost and rediscovered, that we are not the first to think we had it all figured out. And if that's true, then maybe the most important thing we can do is listen to those myths. Not dismiss them as primitive superstition, but treat them as what they might actually be: warnings, messages from the past telling us that nothing lasts forever, that catastrophe can strike without warning, that the only way to survive is to preserve knowledge in forms that can outlast any single civilization. There's something haunting about standing in front of a structure that's thousands of years old. The stones are weathered, the carvings worn smooth by wind and rain, but they're still there, still standing, still speaking in their silent way across the vast gulf of time. The Great Pyramid of Giza has stood for more than 4,500 years. It was already ancient when Cleopatra walked the earth. It was old when Rome was founded, and it will likely still be standing long after our modern cities have crumbled to dust. Why did the Egyptians build it? The conventional answer is that it was a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, a monument to his power and a gateway to the afterlife. But the pyramid contains no inscriptions, no hieroglyphs, no decorations of any kind, unusual for an Egyptian tomb. The sarcophagus inside is empty and shows no signs of ever having been used. And the precision of the construction, the alignment to the cardinal directions, the mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions, all suggest that it was designed to communicate something beyond simply housing a body. Some researchers argue that the pyramid was never meant to be a tomb at all, that it was built as a monument of knowledge, a three-dimensional textbook in stone, designed to preserve mathematical and astronomical information for future generations. The dimensions encode pi, the golden ratio, the size of the Earth, the distance to the Sun. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is debated, but the fact remains. The information is there, waiting to be read by anyone with the knowledge to decode it. And the pyramid is not alone. All over the world, ancient structures seem designed to last, to communicate, to preserve something beyond the immediate needs of the people who built them. Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in England is a circle of massive stones that were transported from quarries hundreds of miles away. The effort required to move these stones, to shape them, to erect them in precise positions was enormous. And for what? To mark the solstices, to track the moon, to create a sacred space. Perhaps all of those things, but perhaps also to create a monument that would endure, that would mark the landscape in a way that could not be erased, that would tell future generations, we were here, we knew things, we understood the sky and the earth and the cycles that govern them. The same impulse appears in the Americas. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon are aligned to astronomical events and built on a scale that rivals anything in Egypt. The city itself is laid out in a grid that reflects cosmic principles, with the Avenue of the Dead running north-south, and the structures positioned to mirror the heavens. Who built Teotihuacan? We don't know. The city was already abandoned when the Aztecs found it, and they named it the place where the gods were created because they believed it was so ancient and so grand that only gods could have built it. The Aztecs had no memory of the people who actually constructed it, no records, no stories. The city was a mystery even to them. In South America, the ruins of Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia contain stonework of astonishing precision. The blocks are cut and fitted with such accuracy that they seem almost machined. Some of the stones weigh more than 100 tons, and they were transported from quarries miles away, across difficult terrain, and then lifted into place with techniques we still don't fully understand. The conventional dating places Tiwanaku around 500 CE, but some researchers argue that parts of the site are much older, possibly predating the Inca by thousands of years. The evidence is in the weathering patterns, the style of construction, and the fact that some of the structures appear to have been built in multiple phases, with later cultures building on top of much older foundations. And then there's Göbekli Tepe, which has rewritten our understanding of what was possible in the ancient world. This site in Turkey, with its massive T-shaped pillars carved with intricate reliefs of animals, was built around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. At a time when humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, someone organised the labour to quarry, transport and erect stones weighing up to 20 tons, and then carved them with sophisticated artwork. The site was used for about 1,000 years, and then it was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned. Buried. Someone filled in the entire complex with dirt and rubble, preserving it perfectly until it was rediscovered in the 1990s. Why would they do that? Why go to the effort of burying something so massive and so important? One theory is that they were preserving it, that they knew something was coming, a catastrophe, a change, a collapse, and they wanted to protect the site so that it could be found again later. By burying it, they ensured that it would survive whatever was about to happen. If that's true, then Göbekli Tepe is a time capsule, a message from the people of the Younger Dryas, telling us that they were here, that they were capable of great things, and that they knew their world was ending. But the message isn't just in the structures themselves, it's in the symbols carved into the stones. At Göbekli Tepe, the pillars are covered with images of animals: foxes, snakes, birds, scorpions. Some researchers believe these are not just decorative but astronomical, representing constellations and cosmic events. One pillar, known as the Vulture Stone, has been interpreted as a star map depicting the sky as it appeared around 10,250 BCE, with symbols that may represent a comet impact. If this interpretation is correct, then the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not just recording what they saw, they were warning future generations about what had happened and what could happen again. The same symbolic language appears in other ancient sites. The Serpent Mound in Ohio, a massive earthwork shaped like a snake, aligns with the summer solstice and may represent astronomical knowledge. The Nazca lines in Peru include geometric shapes that some researchers believe are maps of underground water sources, while others argue they represent constellations or ritual pathways. These symbols are a language, but it's a language we've largely forgotten how to read. We can see the shapes, the alignments, the patterns, but we can't always understand what they mean. It's like finding a book written in a script you don't recognize. You know it contains information, but you can't access it. And that might be the point. If you want to preserve knowledge across a catastrophe that will destroy your civilization, you can't just write it down. Writing systems change, languages evolve, and future generations might not be able to read your words. But if you encode the knowledge in symbols, in architecture, in alignments that reflect universal principles like the movement of the stars, then anyone with the intelligence to observe and measure can eventually decode it. The pyramids, the megaliths, the earthworks, they're not just monuments, they're archives. They're messages in stone designed to outlast any written language, any spoken tradition, any single culture. They're humanity's attempt to speak across the abyss of time, to ensure that even if everything else is lost, something will remain. And the myths are the key to reading those messages. They're the instruction manual, the context, the explanation of what the stones are trying to say. Without the myths, the monuments are just impressive piles of rock. But with the myths, they become part of a larger story. A story of knowledge preserved, of warnings given, of a civilization that knew it was ending and did everything it could to make sure its wisdom would survive. If you listen to the myths long enough, you start to notice something unsettling. They don't just describe one catastrophe, they describe many. They speak of worlds that came before, ages that ended in fire or flood or darkness, and new ages that rose from the ashes. The Hindu cosmology is perhaps the most explicit about this. Time, in the Vedic tradition, is not linear but cyclical. The universe goes through kalpas, vast epochs lasting billions of years, during which it is created, sustained and destroyed, only to be created again. Within each kalpa are smaller cycles called yugas, 4 ages that decline in virtue and knowledge until the final age, the Kali Yuga, ends in destruction, and the cycle begins anew. We are, according to this tradition, currently in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, the final phase before the next reset. And while the timescales are cosmic, the pattern is clear. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they decay, and they fall. And then new civilizations rise from the ruins, often forgetting what came before. The Maya had a similar concept. Their long count calendar tracked cycles of time called Baktuns, each lasting about 394 years. 13 Baktuns make up a full cycle of roughly 525 years, and the Maya believed that at the end of each cycle, the world underwent a transformation, not necessarily a complete destruction, but a fundamental change, a shift from one age to another. The famous end date of the Mayan calendar in 2012 was not, as some feared, a prediction of apocalypse. It was simply the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. But the fact that the Maya tracked time in this way, that they saw history as a series of cycles rather than a straight line, suggests they understood something about the nature of civilizations. They don't last forever. The Hopi of North America speak of 4 worlds. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood. We are now in the 4th world, and the prophecies say that it too will end if humanity does not live in balance with nature. But the Hopi also say that a few people will survive, as they have in previous cycles, and they will carry the knowledge forward into the next world. The Norse myths describe Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the world will be consumed by fire and flood, the gods will fall, and almost everything will be destroyed. But the myths also say that after Ragnarok the world will be reborn. A new earth will rise from the sea, green and fertile, and the surviving gods and humans will begin again. Even in the Abrahamic traditions there are echoes of this cyclical view. The Bible speaks of the flood that destroyed the world in Noah's time, and the book of Revelation describes a future apocalypse followed by a new heaven and a new earth. The idea that the world ends and begins again is woven into the fabric of these stories. Why would so many cultures, separated by vast distances and thousands of years, all develop the idea that the world goes through cycles of destruction and rebirth? One possibility is that it's a psychological response to the inevitability of death. Humans are aware of their own mortality, and perhaps we project that awareness onto the world itself, imagining that just as individuals are born and die, so too are civilizations and even the cosmos itself. But another possibility is that these myths are based on observation. That ancient people witnessed the collapse of civilizations, saw how knowledge could be lost, how societies could fall, and they extrapolated from that experience to create a cosmology that reflected the impermanence of all things. And if there was a major catastrophe around 12,000 years ago, a comet impact, a massive flood, a sudden climate shift, then the survivors would have lived through the end of their world. They would have seen their cities destroyed, their knowledge lost, their way of life erased, and they would have told their children about it, and those children would have told their children, until the story became myth, but the lesson remained. The world can end. It has ended before, and it will end again. This is not a comforting message, it's a warning, and it's a call to humility. Because if civilizations are cyclical, if they rise and fall and rise again, then we are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are just the latest iteration, and we are just as vulnerable as those who came before. The archaeological record supports this to some extent. We know that civilizations do collapse. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, all fell within a span of a few decades around 1200 BCE in what's known as the Bronze Age collapse. Cities were burned, trade networks disintegrated, and the region entered a dark age that lasted centuries. The Maya civilization collapsed around 900 CE, with cities abandoned and populations dispersed. The reasons are still debated: drought, warfare, environmental degradation. But the result was clear. A sophisticated civilization vanished, leaving behind only ruins and fragments of knowledge. The Roman Empire fell, the Khmer Empire fell, the ancestral Pueblans of the American Southwest abandoned their cliff dwellings. Over and over we see the same pattern. A civilization rises, flourishes, and then declines, often rapidly, leaving future generations to wonder what happened. And in many cases the knowledge is lost. The Romans knew how to make concrete that could set underwater and last for millennia, but that knowledge was lost in the Middle Ages and only recently rediscovered. The Greeks built the Antikythera mechanism, but no similar device appears in the historical record for more than 1,000 years. The Maya had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, but much of it was lost when the Spanish burned their books. If this can happen to civilizations we know about, civilizations that left extensive written records, how much more could be lost from a civilization that existed before writing, before recorded history? And if the myths are right, if there have been multiple cycles of rise and fall, then the knowledge we think of as new might actually be rediscovered. The principles of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, these are not inventions but discoveries. They exist independently of us, and any sufficiently advanced civilization will eventually find them. So when we see ancient cultures with sophisticated astronomical knowledge, with advanced engineering techniques, with mathematical principles encoded in their monuments, maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Maybe they're not anomalies. Maybe they're exactly what we should expect from a species that has been through this cycle before. One of the most persistent themes in ancient myths is the figure of the teacher, the wise one who comes from elsewhere, who possesses knowledge that the local people do not have, and who shares that knowledge before departing. We've already mentioned some of these figures: the Apkallu of Sumer, Thoth of Egypt, Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, Viracocha of South America. But the pattern appears in even more cultures, and the details are remarkably consistent. In ancient China, the legendary Yellow Emperor Huangdi is credited with teaching the people agriculture, medicine, writing, and the principles of governance. He is described as a divine figure who descended from the heavens and transformed Chinese civilization before ascending back to the sky. In Polynesia, the god Maui is said to have taught the people how to fish, how to make fire, and how to navigate the vast Pacific Ocean. He's a trickster figure, but also a culture hero, someone who brought essential knowledge to humanity. In West Africa, the Dogon people speak of the Nommo, amphibious beings who came from the star system Sirius, and taught the people about astronomy, agriculture, and the structure of the universe. The Dogon's knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star that cannot be seen without a telescope, has puzzled researchers for decades. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the Wandjina are ancestral beings who came during the Dreamtime and taught the people the laws and customs they needed to survive. The Wandjina are depicted in rock art with large eyes and no mouths, and the paintings are said to be so sacred that they must be periodically retouched to maintain their power. What's striking about all these stories is that the teachers are always described as coming from somewhere else. They're not born into the culture they transform. They arrive, often from the sea or the sky, and they bring knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for the time period. The conventional explanation is that these are mythologized versions of real historical figures, shamans, priests, or travellers who introduced new ideas and were later deified, or they're symbolic representations of the process of cultural development, personified as divine teachers to make the stories more memorable. But there's another interpretation. What if these myths are describing actual contact between different groups of people, specifically between survivors of an advanced civilization and the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered after their own world collapsed? Imagine you're a survivor of a catastrophe that destroyed your civilization. You have knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, mathematics, engineering, but you have no cities, no infrastructure, no way to rebuild what was lost. You're wandering in a world that has been transformed, and you encounter people who are living in a much more primitive way. What would you do? You might try to teach them. You might share your knowledge, hoping that it will take root, that these people will preserve it and build something new. You might become, to them, a teacher, a wise one, a figure of legend. And if you came from across the sea, if you arrived in boats or rafts, you would be described as coming from the water. If you had knowledge of the stars, you might be associated with the sky. If you taught them things they had never known, you would seem almost godlike in your wisdom. Over generations, the memory of who you really were would fade. The details would be lost, the story would be embellished, and you would become a myth. But the core truth would remain. Someone came, someone taught, and everything changed. This scenario is speculative, but it fits the pattern of the myths, and it would explain why so many early civilizations seem to have appeared suddenly, with knowledge that seems too advanced for their supposed level of development. The Sumerians, for instance, appear in the historical record around 4000 BCE with a fully developed writing system, sophisticated mathematics, complex astronomy, and advanced irrigation techniques. There's no clear precursor, no gradual development that we can trace. They just seem to arrive, already civilized. The same is true of the Egyptians. The earliest dynasties show a level of sophistication in art, architecture, and administration that suggests a long period of development, but we don't have clear evidence of that development. It's as if Egyptian civilization emerged fully formed. In the Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization appears around 3300 BCE, with planned cities, standardized weights and measures, and a writing system we still can't decipher. Again, there's a sense of sudden emergence, of a civilization that seems to have skipped the usual stages of development. Could these civilizations have been seeded by survivors of an earlier culture? Could the myths of teachers and culture heroes be describing real people who carried knowledge forward from a lost world? It's a tantalizing possibility, but it's also difficult to prove. The evidence is circumstantial. The myths, the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge, the similarities between distant cultures. But circumstantial evidence is still evidence, and when you have enough of it pointing in the same direction, it starts to form a picture. And that picture suggests that human history is not a simple story of gradual progress from primitive to advanced. It's a more complex story, with cycles of rise and fall, with knowledge lost and rediscovered, with survivors carrying fragments of wisdom across the abyss of catastrophe, and planting seeds that would grow into new civilizations. The myths, in this view, are not just stories. They're the oral history of this process. They're the record of how knowledge was transmitted, how civilizations were seeded, how the survivors of one world became the teachers of the next. And if that's true, then we owe those teachers a debt. Because without them, without their determination to preserve and transmit what they knew, we might still be starting from scratch. We might not have the knowledge that allowed us to build our own civilization. But we also owe them our attention, because if they went to such lengths to preserve their knowledge, to encode it in myths and monuments and symbols, then maybe they were trying to tell us something important. Maybe they were trying to warn us about what can happen, about how quickly everything can be lost, about the fragility of civilization itself. And maybe, just maybe, we should listen. If there was a civilization before the ones we know, where would we find it? The answer, most likely, is underwater. During the last ice age, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. That's not a small difference. It means that vast expanses of land that are now ocean floor were once dry, habitable, and potentially populated. The continental shelves, the shallow underwater extensions of the continents, were exposed. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean was smaller, with land bridges connecting islands. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe. Indonesia was part of a massive landmass called Sunderland, connecting the islands into a single continent. These weren't marginal lands. They were prime real estate, coastal plains with access to both land and sea resources, river valleys with fertile soil, temperate climates ideal for human habitation. If you were going to build a civilization, these are exactly the places you would choose. And then the ice melted. Over the course of several thousand years, the seas rose slowly at first and then more rapidly during periods of catastrophic meltwater pulses. The coastlines retreated, the river valleys flooded, and the land was swallowed by the ocean. Any settlements on those coasts would have been inundated. Any cities, any monuments, any evidence of human habitation would now be underwater, buried under centuries of sediment, almost impossible to find without deliberate searching. And we've barely looked. Underwater archaeology is expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. The ocean is vast, visibility is often poor, and the sediment can be meters thick. Finding a submerged settlement is like looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is the size of a continent and buried under mud. But when we do look, we sometimes find things. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have discovered stone structures, walls and artifacts that appear to be man-made. The site is controversial. Some researchers believe it's the remains of an ancient city, possibly the legendary Dwarka mentioned in Hindu texts, while others argue that the structures are natural formations. But the artifacts are real, and they're old, dating back thousands of years. In the Mediterranean, there are numerous submerged ruins. Off the coast of Egypt, the ancient cities of Heracleion and Canopus were discovered underwater, preserved beneath the sea for more than 1,000 years. These were major cities in their time, and they were lost not to war or fire, but to gradual subsidence and rising seas. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument is a massive rock formation that some researchers believe shows signs of human modification. Straight edges, right angles, carved steps. Others argue it's entirely natural, the result of geological processes. The debate continues, but the formation is undeniably striking, and it raises questions about what else might be hidden beneath the waves. In the Black Sea, underwater archaeologists have found evidence of ancient settlements on what was once the shoreline, before the sea level rose and flooded the area. These discoveries support the theory that the Black Sea flood, when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus, was a real event that would have been catastrophic for the people living in the region. And these are just the sites we've found. How many more are out there, still undiscovered, still buried beneath the sediment? The problem is that we're not looking in the right places. Most underwater archaeology focuses on known historical sites, shipwrecks, ports, cities that we know existed because they're mentioned in historical records. We're not systematically surveying the continental shelves, the submerged river valleys, the places where people would have lived during the Ice Age. And even if we were, the evidence might be difficult to recognise. After 10,000 years underwater, stone structures can be weathered beyond recognition. Organic. Materials would be long gone. Metal would have corroded. What remains might look like natural formations, indistinguishable from the surrounding geology unless you know what to look for. But the myths give us clues. They tell us where to look. The flood myths often mention specific locations, mountains where the survivors took refuge, valleys that were inundated, islands that disappeared. If we take these myths seriously, if we treat them as garbled but genuine memories of real places, then they become a map. The Sumerians spoke of Dilmun, a paradise land to the east that was eventually flooded. Could this be a memory of the Persian Gulf Valley, before it became a sea? The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that sank in a day and a night. Could this be a distorted memory of a real island or coastal settlement that was lost to rising seas or a tsunami? The Hindus spoke of Kumari Kandam, a lost continent in the Indian Ocean. Could this be a memory of the submerged lands off the coast of India, the continental shelf that was exposed during the Ice Age? These are speculative connections, but they're not baseless. The geography described in the myths often corresponds to real places that are now underwater, and if the myths are memories, then they're telling us where to look for the evidence of what was lost. There's also the question of what we would find if we did discover a submerged city from 12,000 years ago. Would it look like the cities we know? Would it have pyramids and temples and monuments? Maybe not. Maybe the civilization that existed before the flood built differently. Maybe they used materials that didn't survive: wood, mud brick, organic compounds. Maybe their cities were designed to be in harmony with the landscape, rather than dominating it, and so they left a lighter footprint. Or maybe they did build in stone, and we just haven't found it yet. The ocean is vast, and we've explored less than 5% of it. There could be entire cities down there, waiting to be discovered, and we would never know unless we looked. But even without physical cities, the myths themselves are evidence. They're too consistent, too widespread, too specific to be dismissed as pure fantasy. They describe real events: floods, catastrophes, lost lands, and they describe them in ways that align with what we know about the end of the Ice Age. The coastlines that are now underwater were once home to people. Those people had cultures, knowledge, possibly even cities. And when the seas rose, they were forced to move, to adapt, to carry their memories inland and pass them down through generations. Those memories became myths, and those myths are the last surviving record of a world that vanished beneath the waves. There's something almost eerie about how much ancient people knew about the sky. They tracked the movements of the planets with precision. They predicted eclipses. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle so slow that it takes 26,000 years to complete. They built monuments aligned to celestial events with an accuracy that rivals modern engineering. And they did all of this without telescopes, without computers, without any of the tools we consider essential for astronomy. How? The conventional answer is patience and observation. Ancient astronomers spent generations watching the sky, recording what they saw, passing their knowledge down through oral tradition and eventually through written records. Over centuries they accumulated enough data to recognize patterns, to predict events, to understand the mechanics of the cosmos. This explanation is reasonable. It's how science works: observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement. And there's no doubt that ancient astronomers were skilled observers, capable of remarkable precision. But there are aspects of their knowledge that are harder to explain. The precession of the equinoxes, for instance. This is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which causes the position of the stars to shift over time. The effect is so gradual that you wouldn't notice it in a single lifetime, or even in several lifetimes. You would need to compare observations across centuries, maintaining accurate records and passing them down through generations to even detect that it was happening. And yet, ancient cultures knew about it. The Egyptians encoded it in their mythology, associating different ages with different constellations. The Hindus described it in the Vedas, linking the yugas to the precessional cycle. The Maya tracked it in their calendars. How did they know? How did they maintain the continuity of observation and record-keeping necessary to detect a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete? One possibility is that they inherited the knowledge, that they didn't discover precession themselves but learned about it from an earlier culture that had already done the work of observation and calculation. If there was a civilization during the Ice Age that lasted for thousands of years, they would have had the time to detect precession. They would have had the stability to maintain records, to pass knowledge down through generations, to build an astronomical tradition that spanned millennia. And if that civilization was destroyed, the survivors might have carried that knowledge with them, teaching it to the people they encountered, encoding it in myths and monuments so that it wouldn't be lost. This would explain why so many early civilizations seem to have sophisticated astronomical knowledge right from the start. They didn't develop it themselves, they inherited it. The same pattern appears with mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, which is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. This system is incredibly sophisticated, allowing for easy division and calculation, and it's not the kind of thing you would expect a newly emerging civilization to invent. The Egyptians understood geometry well enough to build the pyramids, with their precise angles and alignments. The Harappans of the Indus Valley had standardized weights and measures, suggesting a deep understanding of mathematics and trade. Where did this knowledge come from? Did each civilization independently develop these concepts, or were they taught? The myths suggest the latter. They speak of teachers, of wise ones who came and shared their knowledge. And if those teachers were survivors of an earlier civilization, then the knowledge they shared would have been the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years. But there's another layer to this. Some researchers argue that ancient monuments are not just aligned to celestial events, but actually encode astronomical data in their structure. The Great Pyramid, for instance, is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. Its dimensions, when measured in ancient Egyptian cubits, produce numbers that relate to the size of the Earth and the distance to the Sun. The shafts inside the pyramid point to specific stars, Sirius, Orion, Thuban, that were significant in Egyptian cosmology. Are these coincidences, or were the builders deliberately encoding information in the structure, creating a monument that would communicate astronomical knowledge to anyone who studied it carefully? At Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the temple complex is aligned to the spring equinox, and its layout mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared in 10,500 BCE. The same date appears in the alignment of the Sphinx and the pyramids of Giza, which some researchers argue were positioned to reflect the sky as it looked at that time. Why would monuments built thousands of years later encode information about the sky as it appeared thousands of years earlier? One theory is that they were commemorating something, an event, a time, a civilization that existed at that date and wanted to be remembered. The Nazca lines in Peru include geometric shapes and animal figures that some researchers believe represent constellations. The lines themselves are so large that they can only be fully appreciated from the air, which raises the question, who were they meant for? Who was supposed to see them? The conventional answer is that they were ritual pathways, meant to be walked by the people who created them, with the full design visible only to the gods in the sky. But another interpretation is that they were meant to be seen from above by people who had the ability to fly, or at least by people who understood that future generations might develop that ability. In other words, the Nazca lines might be a message from the past to the future, encoded in the landscape, waiting to be read by anyone with the technology to see it from the air. This idea that ancient monuments are messages that they encode knowledge in forms designed to survive across millennia, is central to the theory that myths and megaliths are the last surviving archive of a lost civilization. If you know your world is ending, if you know that everything you've built will be destroyed, how do you preserve your knowledge? You can't rely on books. They burn, they decay, they're lost. You can't rely on oral tradition alone. It changes, it's forgotten, it's distorted over time. But if you encode your knowledge in stone, in alignments, in mathematical relationships that reflect universal principles, then anyone with the intelligence to observe and measure can eventually decode it. The information becomes independent of language, independent of culture, independent of any single civilization. It becomes eternal, and that's what the ancient monuments might be. Eternal archives, designed to outlast any catastrophe, to speak across the abyss of time, to ensure that the knowledge of the first civilization would never be completely lost. But not all knowledge can be encoded in stone and stars. Some things are too complex, too nuanced, too dependent on context to be reduced to geometry and alignment. For those things, you need stories, and that's where the myths come in. Because myths are not just narratives, they're mnemonic devices, memory palaces built out of words and images, designed to preserve information in a form that can be passed down through oral tradition. The Aboriginal Australians have used this technique for tens of thousands of years. Their Dreamtime stories are not just myths, they're maps, encyclopedias, legal codes, and historical records all woven together into narratives that can be memorized and recited. A single Dreamtime story might encode information about water sources, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, social laws, and the history of the land, all wrapped in a tale about ancestral beings who shaped the world. The story is entertaining, memorable, and meaningful on multiple levels, which ensures that it gets passed down accurately from generation to generation. This is the power of myth as a preservation technology. It's not as precise as writing, but it's more durable. A written text can be lost, burned, or forgotten, but a story that's embedded in the culture, that's told and retold, that's part of the identity of the people, can survive for millennia. And if you want to preserve knowledge across a catastrophe, this is exactly the kind of technology you would use. So when we look at ancient myths, we should ask, what information are they trying to preserve? What knowledge is encoded in these stories? Some of it is practical. Flood myths might preserve the memory of rising seas and the need to move to higher ground. Stories about fire from the sky might preserve the memory of comet impacts or volcanic eruptions. Tales of golden ages might preserve the memory of a time when life was easier, when the climate was more stable, when civilization flourished. But some of it might be more abstract. Myths often deal with cosmic principles, the nature of time, the structure of the universe, the relationship between order and chaos. These aren't just philosophical musings. They might be attempts to preserve a sophisticated understanding of the world, encoded in symbolic language because that's the only way to make it memorable. Consider the Egyptian myth of Osiris. Osiris is killed by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered across the land. His wife Isis gathers the pieces and resurrects him, but he can no longer rule the living world, so he becomes the lord of the underworld. His son Horus avenges him and becomes the new king. On the surface, this is a story about death, resurrection, and succession. But it's also been interpreted as an astronomical allegory, with Osiris representing the constellation Orion, Isis representing Sirius, and the story encoding information about the precession of the equinoxes and the heliacal rising of Sirius, which marked the beginning of the Nile flood. Is this reading correct? It's debated. But the fact that the myth can be interpreted on multiple levels, as a moral tale, as a political allegory, as an astronomical code, is exactly what you would expect if it was designed to preserve information in a durable form. The same is true of many other myths. The Greek story of Phaethon, who steals his father's sun chariot and nearly destroys the earth before being struck down by Zeus, has been interpreted as a memory of a comet impact or a close encounter with another celestial body. The Norse myth of Fimbulwinter, a great winter that precedes Ragnarok, sounds like a description of a volcanic winter or an impact winter. The Hindu Mahabharata contains passages that describe weapons of unimaginable power, weapons that produce blinding light, mushroom-shaped clouds, and lingering sickness that sounds disturbingly like radiation poisoning. Are these purely imaginative, or are they garbled descriptions of something real, something witnessed and remembered and passed down through generations until the specifics were lost, but the horror remained? We can't know for certain. But what we can say is that myths are not random. They're structured, they're purposeful, and they often contain information that seems too specific, too accurate, to be pure invention. And if myths are memory, if they're the oral archive of a lost civilization, then we should be paying more attention to them. Not taking them literally, that's a mistake, but taking them seriously, treating them as data, as clues, as fragments of a larger picture that we're trying to reconstruct. Because the myths are telling us something. They're telling us that the world has ended before, that civilizations have risen and fallen, that knowledge has been lost and preserved and lost again, that we are not the first, and we may not be the last. And they're telling us that the survivors of those previous worlds did everything they could to make sure their knowledge would endure. They encoded it in stories, in symbols, in monuments, in the very fabric of their cultures, so that even if everything else was destroyed, something would remain. The myths are that something. They're the last surviving voice of the first civilization, speaking to us across the abyss of time, telling us what they knew, warning us about what can happen, reminding us that nothing lasts forever, and maybe, just maybe, teaching us how to survive when our own world ends. So what are we left with? We have myths, stories told by cultures all over the world, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of years, yet telling remarkably similar tales. We have flood stories, teacher gods, lost golden ages, and cosmic catastrophes. We have architectural marvels that seem to appear fully formed, with no clear developmental pathway. We have astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. We have geological evidence of rapid climate change and rising seas that would have drowned entire coastlines. We have linguistic connections that span continents. We have symbols that repeat across cultures that supposedly never met. Individually, each of these things can be explained away. Coincidence, convergent evolution, diffusion through trade routes we haven't discovered yet, misinterpretation of the evidence, overactive imagination seeing patterns where none exist. But taken together, they form something harder to dismiss. They form a picture, and that picture suggests that human history is longer, stranger, and more cyclical than we've been taught to believe. The standard narrative is clean and simple. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, then suddenly, around 10,000 years ago, we figured out agriculture and civilization began. First in Mesopotamia, then Egypt, then the Indus Valley, then China. A steady march of progress from primitive to advanced, from stone tools to smartphones. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if it's missing a chapter, or several chapters? What if there were earlier attempts at civilization, earlier experiments in settled life, earlier accumulations of knowledge, all of which were wiped away by the catastrophes that mark the end of the Ice Age? The evidence doesn't prove this, but it suggests it, it whispers it, and the myths shout it. Let's talk about the things that don't quite fit the timeline we've been given. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the last century, and it's still not fully understood. The site dates to around 9600 BCE, that's 11,600 years ago, and it consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The conventional narrative says that at this time, humans were still hunter-gatherers. Agriculture hadn't been invented, Yet, there were no cities, no states, no organised religion as we understand it. And yet here's this massive construction project, requiring the coordination of hundreds of people, the quarrying and transport of stones weighing up to 20 tons, and the artistic skill to carve them with sophisticated imagery. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. Someone filled it in with dirt, preserving it for millennia. Why? We don't know. But the act of burial suggests that the site was important enough to protect, even if it could no longer be used. And here's the thing. Göbekli Tepe isn't primitive. It's not a crude first attempt at monumental architecture. It's sophisticated, complex, and clearly the work of people who knew what they were doing. Which raises the question, where did they learn? What came before Göbekli Tepe that taught them how to do this? The standard answer is that we haven't found it yet, that there must be earlier, simpler sites that show the development of these skills. But what if there aren't any? What if Göbekli Tepe represents not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something, or even the end of something? Then there's the Sphinx. The conventional date for its construction is around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Khafre. But there's a problem. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx don't match the weathering patterns on other structures from that period. The Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, deep vertical channels carved by heavy rainfall. But Egypt has been arid for thousands of years. The last time the region experienced rainfall heavy enough to cause that kind of erosion was at the end of the Ice Age, around 10,000 years ago or earlier. This observation, made by geologist Robert Schoch, has been controversial. Egyptologists argue that the erosion could be caused by other factors: wind, sand, chemical weathering. But Schoch maintains that the patterns are consistent with water erosion, and that the Sphinx is therefore much older than conventionally believed. If he's right, then the Sphinx predates Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. It would mean that there was someone in the Nile Valley, long before the pharaohs, with the knowledge and resources to carve a massive monument out of living rock. And it would mean that the Egyptians inherited the Sphinx rather than built it, which might explain why there are no inscriptions on it, no clear records of its construction, and why it seems stylistically different from other Old Kingdom monuments. In South America there's Puma Punku, part of the Tiwanaku site in Bolivia. The stonework there is extraordinary. Massive blocks of andesite and diorite, some weighing over 100 tons, cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar. The surfaces are smooth, the angles are exact, and some of the blocks have complex interlocking shapes that would be difficult to produce even with modern tools. The conventional date for Puma Punku is around 500, 600 CE, but some researchers argue that the site is much older, pointing to the same kind of evidence we see elsewhere: sophisticated techniques that seem to appear fully formed with no clear developmental pathway. And there are legends among the local people that the site was built by the gods in a single night before the Great Flood. Again, we're seeing this pattern: advanced construction, mysterious origins, and myths that point to an earlier time. And then there are the maps. In 1929, a Turkish naval officer discovered an old map in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The map, known as the Piri Reis map, was drawn in 1513 and showed the coastlines of South America and Africa with remarkable accuracy. But it also showed something else: the coastline of Antarctica depicted without ice. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and it's been covered in ice for millions of years. Or so we thought. But recent research has shown that parts of Antarctica were ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, and possibly more recently in some areas. The Piri Reis map appears to show the coastline as it would have looked during one of these ice-free periods. Piri Reis himself noted on the map that he had compiled it from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. This raises an extraordinary question: who mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free? And how did that knowledge survive long enough to be copied onto medieval maps? These are the anomalies, the things that don't quite fit. The pieces of the puzzle that suggest the picture we've been given is incomplete. Language is another clue, though it's a more subtle one. The conventional view is that human languages evolved independently in different regions, diverging from common ancestral languages as populations spread across the globe, and for the most part this is true. But there are some curious connections that are hard to explain. Take the word for water. In ancient Sumerian it's A. In ancient Egyptian it's mu. In Polynesian languages it's vai or y. In the Mayan language it's ha. These are cultures separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years of independent development. Yet there are similarities, not exact matches, but echoes. Some linguists argue that these are coincidences, or that they reflect universal human tendencies in how we form words for basic concepts. Others suggest that they might be remnants of a much older proto-global language that existed before the population separated. There's also the curious case of the Ainu people of Japan, whose language is unrelated to Japanese or any other known language family. It's an isolate, a linguistic orphan. The same is true of Basque in Europe, Sumerian in Mesopotamia, and several other languages around the world. These languages don't fit into the family trees we've constructed. They stand alone, suggesting either that they're the last survivors of much older language families that have otherwise gone extinct, or that they represent something we don't yet understand about the history of human migration and settlement. And then there are the symbols. The swastika, for example, is found in cultures all over the world, in India, in China, in pre-Columbian America, in ancient Greece, in Celtic Europe. It's a simple geometric shape, so it's possible that different cultures invented it independently. But it's also possible that it's a symbol that was passed down from a common source, a piece of visual language that survived the fragmentation of cultures. The same is true of the spiral, the cross, the circle, the triangle. These symbols appear everywhere, often with similar meanings. The spiral representing cycles or journeys, the cross representing the four directions or the intersection of earth and sky, the circle representing wholeness or eternity. Are these universal human archetypes emerging independently from the structure of the human mind? Or are they inherited symbols passed down from a time when human cultures were more connected than we realize? The linguistic evidence is circumstantial, but it's there, and it suggests that the story of human language, and by extension human culture, might be more interconnected than the standard narrative allows. So if there was a civilization before the ones we know about, what might it have looked like? This is where we have to be careful, because we're moving from evidence into speculation. But it's informed speculation, based on what we know about the end of the Ice Age and the capabilities of ancient peoples. First, it wouldn't have looked like our civilization. It wouldn't have had skyscrapers or computers or industrial factories. Those things require not just knowledge, but specific resources, fossil fuels, rare earth metals, a global supply chain. A pre-Ice Age civilization would have been built on different foundations. But that doesn't mean it was primitive. There are many ways to be advanced. Imagine a maritime culture, spread across the coastal regions of the world during the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. These people would have been expert sailors, navigating by the stars, following ocean currents, trading goods and ideas across vast distances. They would have built their cities on the coastlines, near river mouths, in the fertile lowlands that are now underwater. They would have understood astronomy, because navigation requires it. They would have tracked the movements of the sun, moon and stars, not just for practical purposes, but as a way of understanding the cosmos and their place in it. This knowledge would have been encoded in their architecture, their calendars, their myths. They would have been skilled engineers, capable of moving massive stones and constructing monuments that could withstand earthquakes and floods. They would have understood geometry, proportion, and the properties of different materials, but their technology would have been based on stone, wood, rope, and human labour, materials that decay, leaving little trace. They would have had a sophisticated understanding of agriculture and ecology, knowing which plants to cultivate, which animals to domesticate, how to manage the land to sustain a population. But their agriculture might have been different from ours, more focused on perennial crops, forest gardens, and aquaculture, rather than the annual grain crops that dominate modern agriculture. And they would have had a rich cultural and spiritual life, with myths and rituals that connected them to the land, the sea, and the sky. These myths would have been their science, their history, their philosophy, all woven together in stories that could be remembered and passed down. This is speculation, but it's not wild speculation. It's based on what we know about the capabilities of ancient peoples, the resources available during the Ice Age, and the kinds of knowledge that can be preserved without writing. And then the ice melted. Over the course of a few thousand years, and in some cases much faster, the seas rose, the coastlines drowned, and the world changed. The people who survived would have moved inland, carrying with them what knowledge they could. Some of it would have been preserved in myths and symbols, some of it would have been lost, and some of it would have been passed on to the new civilizations that emerged in the river valleys, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, the Yellow River. These new civilizations would have inherited fragments of the old knowledge, astronomy, geometry, agriculture, architecture, and built on them, creating their own unique cultures. But the source of that knowledge, the original civilization that developed it, would have been forgotten, surviving only in myths of a golden age, a time before the flood, when the gods walked among men. There's a reason this idea is controversial, and it's not just about the evidence, it's about identity. It's about how we see ourselves and our place in history. The narrative of progress is deeply embedded in modern culture. We like to think that we're the pinnacle of human achievement, that we've climbed higher than any civilization before us, that we're smarter, more advanced, more enlightened than our ancestors. This narrative gives us a sense of purpose and direction. It tells us that history is moving forward, that we're building towards something greater. But if there was a civilization before ours that was also advanced, that also accumulated knowledge and built great works, and that was destroyed by forces beyond its control, then the narrative of progress becomes less certain. It suggests that history is cyclical rather than linear, that civilizations rise and fall, that what we've built could also be lost. That's an uncomfortable thought. It challenges our sense of security, our belief in the permanence of our achievements. It suggests that we're not as special as we think we are, that we're just the latest iteration in a long series of human experiments in civilization. And there's another psychological barrier, the sunk cost fallacy. Archaeology and anthropology have spent more than a century building a detailed timeline of human history, based on thousands of excavations, millions of artifacts, and countless hours of analysis. That timeline is taught in every university, published in every textbook, and accepted as fact by the general public. To suggest that this timeline is incomplete, that there's a missing chapter, is to suggest that all of that work might need to be revised. And revisions are hard. They require admitting that we were wrong, or at least that we didn't have the full picture. They require reopening questions that were thought to be settled. They require humility. And academia, like any human institution, doesn't always handle humility well. There's also the problem of evidence. The standard of proof in archaeology is high, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the claim that there was a lost civilization before the ones we know about is an extraordinary claim. But here's the thing. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found something doesn't mean it didn't exist. It might mean we haven't looked in the right places, or that the evidence was destroyed, or that we don't yet have the tools to recognize it. The ocean floor, for example, is largely unexplored. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the bottom of the ocean. If there were coastal cities during the Ice Age, and if those cities are now under 400 feet of water, we might never find them unless we specifically go looking. And even then, after 12,000 years of sediment, erosion and tectonic activity, there might not be much left to find. So the resistance to this idea is partly about evidence, but it's also about psychology, about identity, about the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from, and maybe that's the biggest barrier of all. Let's be honest about something. Academia has a gatekeeping problem. This isn't unique to archaeology or anthropology. It's true of any field where knowledge is institutionalized, where careers depend on publishing in the right journals, getting grants from the right sources, and adhering to the accepted paradigms. There's a natural conservatism in any established system, a resistance to ideas that challenge the status quo. And the idea of a lost civilization is definitely a challenge to the status quo. The problem is that this idea has been tainted by association with pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, and outright frauds. There are people who claim that the lost civilization was Atlantis, or that it was built by aliens, or that it possessed magical technologies that defy the laws of physics. These claims are not supported by evidence, and they've done real damage to the credibility of anyone who asks legitimate questions about the timeline of human history. So when a serious researcher suggests that there might be something to the myths, that there might be evidence of an earlier civilization, they risk being lumped in with the cranks and the charlatans. They risk their reputation, their funding, their career. This creates a chilling effect. It discourages people from asking uncomfortable questions, from exploring unconventional ideas, from challenging the accepted narrative. And that's a problem, because science is supposed to be about questioning, about testing hypotheses, about following the evidence wherever it leads. But there are signs that this is changing. In recent years, there's been a growing willingness to reconsider some of the assumptions that have guided archaeology for the past century. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe, for example, has forced a rethinking of the timeline for the development of complex societies. The evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is being taken more seriously. The exploration of submerged sites is revealing new information about coastal settlements that were lost to rising seas. These developments don't prove that there was a lost civilization, but they do suggest that the story of human history is more complex than we thought, and they open the door to asking bigger questions, to considering possibilities that were previously dismissed out of hand. The key is to approach these questions with rigor, with skepticism, and with a commitment to evidence. Not to accept every wild theory that comes along, but not to dismiss ideas simply because they're unconventional. Because if we're not willing to question our assumptions, if we're not willing to revise our understanding when new evidence emerges, then we're not doing science. We're just defending a dogma. And the evidence is emerging. Slowly, piece by piece, discoveries are being made that don't quite fit the conventional timeline. In 2001, marine engineers working off the coast of Gujarat, India, discovered what appeared to be geometric structures on the ocean floor about 120 feet below the surface. Sonar images showed what looked like walls, foundations, and other architectural features spread over an area of several square miles. Artifacts recovered from the site, including pottery and wood, were carbon dated to around 7500 BCE, more than 9,000 years ago. If these structures are real, and that's still debated, then they would represent a significant coastal settlement that was submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The site is now known as the Gulf of Kambat Cultural Complex, and it's still being investigated. In the Mediterranean, there are numerous submerged ruins that date back thousands of years. Off the coast of Egypt, near Alexandria, archaeologists have found the remains of ancient cities that were submerged by earthquakes and rising seas. In the Aegean, there are submerged settlements from the Bronze Age. Off the coast of Israel, there are stone structures that may be 10,000 years old. These discoveries are important because they show that coastal settlements were common in the ancient world and that many of them are now underwater. If we want to understand the full scope of ancient human activity, we need to look beneath the waves. In Turkey, Ongoing excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue to reveal new structures and new mysteries. The site is much larger than initially thought, and only a small fraction of it has been excavated. Each new discovery pushes back the timeline for complex societies and raises new questions about what came before. In South America, LIDAR technology is revealing hidden structures beneath the jungle canopy. Massive earthworks, roads, and settlements that were previously unknown. These discoveries are showing that the Amazon was not an untouched wilderness, but a landscape that was extensively modified by human activity for thousands of years. And in Antarctica, ice core samples and geological surveys are revealing that parts of the continent were ice-free more recently than previously thought. This doesn't prove that anyone lived there, but it does show that the climate history of the planet is more complex than we realized, and that there were periods when regions that are now uninhabitable might have been more hospitable. These discoveries don't add up to proof of a lost civilization, but they do add up to a picture of human history that is more complex, more ancient, and more interconnected than the standard narrative suggests. And they remind us that we're still learning, still discovering, still piecing together the story of who we are and where we came from. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the myths are right. That there was a civilization before ours, a maritime culture that flourished during the Ice Age and was destroyed by the rising seas and climate chaos that marked the end of that era. What would that mean? First, it would mean that human history is longer and more complex than we've been taught. It would mean that the story of civilization doesn't begin 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, but much earlier, in a time and place that we've only glimpsed through myths and fragments. Second, it would mean that we're not the first advanced human civilization. We're not the pioneers, the trailblazers, the first to figure out how to build cities and accumulate knowledge. We're the inheritors of a much older tradition, the latest iteration in a long series of experiments in settled life. Third, it would mean that civilization is fragile, that it can be destroyed by forces beyond our control, climate change, natural disasters, cosmic impacts, that all of our achievements, all of our knowledge, all of our monuments and cities and technologies could be wiped away, leaving only fragments for future generations to puzzle over. This is a humbling realization. It challenges the narrative of progress, the idea that we're building towards some inevitable future of greater and greater advancement. It suggests instead that history is cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall, and that the knowledge we've accumulated could be lost just as it was lost before. But it's also a hopeful realization, in a strange way, because if there was a civilization before ours, and if they managed to preserve some of their knowledge through myths and monuments and symbols, then it means that knowledge can survive even the most catastrophic events. It means that the human impulse to learn, to build, to create, to pass on what we know to future generations, that impulse is stronger than any disaster. And it means that we have a responsibility to preserve what we know, to encode it in forms that can outlast our own civilization, to make sure that if our world ends, something will remain for those who come after. The myths are telling us this. They're telling us that the people who came before us understood this responsibility and that they did everything they could to fulfill it. They built monuments that would last for millennia. They encoded their knowledge in stories that could be remembered and retold. They created symbols that could be recognized across cultures and across time. And they left us a message. Remember. Remember that the world has ended before. Remember that knowledge can be lost. Remember that nothing lasts forever. And remember that it's your responsibility to preserve what you know, to pass it on, to make sure that the light of human understanding doesn't go out completely when the darkness comes. And the darkness is coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in our lifetimes, but it's coming. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, the possibility of nuclear war or pandemic or asteroid impact. The threats are real, and they're growing. We like to think that we're different from the civilizations that came before us, that our technology makes us invulnerable, that we've conquered nature and bent it to our will. But that's an illusion. We're just as vulnerable as any civilization that's ever existed, maybe more so, because we've built a global system that's incredibly complex and incredibly fragile. If the power grid goes down, if the supply chains break, if the internet stops working, our civilization would collapse within weeks. All of our knowledge, all of our achievements, all of the information we've accumulated, most of it exists in digital form, stored on servers that require constant power and maintenance. If those systems fail, that information is gone. We're not preserving our knowledge in stone. We're not encoding it in myths that can be passed down orally. We're storing it in the most fragile, ephemeral form imaginable. Electronic data that can be erased with a power surge or a solar flare. This is a problem, and it's a problem that the ancients understood better than we do. They knew that knowledge is precious, that it's hard-won and easily lost. They knew that if you want your knowledge to survive, you have to encode it in forms that can withstand disaster, stone monuments, oral traditions, symbols that can be recognized even if the language is forgotten. We've forgotten this. We've become complacent, assuming that our civilization will last forever, that our knowledge will always be accessible, that we don't need to worry about preserving it for future generations. But if the myths are right, if there was a civilization before ours that thought the same thing, then we're making the same mistake they did. We're assuming that we're special, that we're different, that the rules don't apply to us. And we're wrong. The lesson of the myths is that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, and that we have a responsibility to preserve what we know in forms that can outlast any single society. This means building monuments that will last for millennia. It means creating archives that can survive disasters, not just digital archives but physical ones, carved in stone or metal, stored in multiple locations around the world. It means encoding our most important knowledge in forms that can be understood, even if our languages are forgotten. Mathematical constants, astronomical alignments, visual symbols that transcend culture. And it means telling stories, because stories are the most resilient form of information storage ever invented. They can be remembered, retold, adapted, and passed down through generations, even when everything else is lost. The myths have survived for thousands of years, carrying with them the memory of a lost world. If we want our knowledge to survive, we need to learn from their example. But there's a deeper question here. Beyond the practical concerns of preserving knowledge and learning from the past, if we're not the first advanced human civilization, if there have been others before us that rose and fell and left only fragments behind, then what does that mean for our sense of purpose? What does it mean for the story we tell ourselves about who we are and why we're here? The narrative of progress gives us meaning. It tells us that we're building towards something, that each generation is adding to the accumulated knowledge and achievements of humanity, that we're part of a grand project that stretches from the past into the future. But if history is cyclical, if civilizations rise and fall, and the knowledge is lost and rediscovered and lost again, then what's the point? Why bother building, creating, learning, if it's all going to be destroyed eventually? This is the existential question at the heart of the lost civilization hypothesis, and it's a question that the myths themselves grapple with. The answer, I think, is that the point is not the permanence of what we build. The point is the act of building itself. The point is the knowledge we gain, the beauty we create, the connections we make, the meaning we find in the process of living and learning and creating. The pyramids will eventually crumble. The books will decay, the digital archives will be lost. But that doesn't make them meaningless. They're meaningful because they represent the human impulse to understand, to create, to leave something behind that says, we were here, we mattered, we understood something about the universe and ourselves. And if some of that knowledge survives, if some of those monuments endure, if some of those stories are passed down to future generations, then we've fulfilled our responsibility. We've added our voice to the great conversation that spans the ages, the conversation between past and future, between the civilizations that came before and the ones that will come after. The myths are part of that conversation. They're the voice of the first civilization, speaking to us across the abyss of time, telling us what they learned, warning us about what can happen, reminding us of our responsibility to preserve and pass on what we know. And now it's our turn to add our voice to that conversation, to encode our knowledge in forms that can survive, to tell our stories in ways that future generations can understand. Because if the myths are right, if the cycle continues, if our civilization falls and a new one rises from the ruins, then the stories we tell now, the monuments we build now, the knowledge we preserve now, that will be all that remains of us. And maybe, thousands of years from now, people will look at our ruins and wonder who we were, what we knew, what we were trying to say, and maybe they'll find the clues we left behind, the fragments of our knowledge encoded in stone and symbol and story. And maybe they'll realize, as we're realizing now, that they're not the first, that there were others before them who built and learned and created and tried to preserve what they knew, that they're part of a long chain of human civilizations, each one rising from the ruins of the last, each one adding something to the accumulated wisdom of the species. And maybe that realization will give them the same sense of humility and responsibility that it gives us. The understanding that we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but one link in a long chain, that our knowledge is precious and fragile, that we have a duty to preserve it, to pass it on, to make sure that the light doesn't go out completely when our world ends. So here we are, at the end of this exploration, and what have we found? We've found myths that tell remarkably similar stories across cultures that supposedly never met. We've found monuments that seem to appear fully formed, with no clear developmental pathway. We've found astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. We found geological evidence of catastrophic climate change at the end of the Ice Age. We found submerged ruins on coastlines that were once dry land. We found linguistic connections that span continents. We found symbols that repeat across time and space. We found anomalies, mysteries, questions that don't have easy answers. And we found resistance from academia, from the established narrative, from our own psychological need to believe that we're special, that we're the first, that we're building towards something permanent. But we've also found something else, a growing willingness to question, to explore, to consider possibilities that were previously dismissed, a recognition that the story of human history is more complex than we thought, that there are chapters we haven't read yet, that the timeline we've been given might be incomplete. The evidence doesn't prove that there was a lost civilization, but it suggests it, it whispers it. And the myths shout it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need absolute proof. Maybe what we need is the humility to admit that we don't know everything, that our understanding of the past is provisional, that there are mysteries we haven't solved yet. Maybe what we need is the curiosity to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, to keep looking for the clues that the ancients left behind. And maybe what we need is the wisdom to listen to the myths, to take them seriously, to treat them as data rather than fantasy. Because the myths are telling us something important. They're telling us that the world has ended before, that civilizations have risen and fallen, that knowledge has been lost and preserved and lost again, that we are not the first and we may not be the last. They're telling us that the survivors of those previous worlds did everything they could to make sure their knowledge would endure, encoding it in stories and symbols and monuments that could outlast any disaster. And they're telling us that it's our turn now, our turn to preserve what we know, to encode it in forms that can survive, to pass it on to future generations. Because if the cycle continues, if our civilization falls and a new one rises from the ruins, then the stories we tell now, the monuments we build now, the knowledge we preserve now, that will be all that remains of us. And maybe, thousands of years from now, people will look at our ruins and wonder who we were, and maybe they'll find the clues we left behind, and maybe they'll realize that they're not alone, that there were others before them who faced the same challenges, who asked the same questions, who tried to preserve what they knew for those who would come after. And maybe they'll hear the echoes, just as we're hearing them now. The echoes of the first civilization, speaking to us across the abyss of time, reminding us of what we've forgotten, teaching us what we need to know. The echoes are faint, but they're there, in the myths, in the monuments, in the symbols carved in stone, in the stories passed down through generations, in the knowledge that seems to appear from nowhere, in the mysteries that don't quite fit the timeline we've been given. The echoes are there, and if we listen, really listen, we might just hear what they're trying to tell us. That we are not the first, that we're not alone, that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a chain of human civilizations stretching back into the mist of time and forward into an uncertain future. That knowledge is precious and fragile, and that we have a responsibility to preserve it, that the world has ended before, and it will end again, and that when it does, the only thing that will survive is what we choose to preserve, the stories we tell, the monuments we build, the knowledge we encode in forms that can outlast any single civilization. The myths are the voice of the first civilization, speaking to us across the ages. And now it's our turn to speak, to add our voice to that ancient conversation, to make sure that when our world ends, something will remain. Something that says, we were here, we learned, we understood, we tried to pass it on, and maybe, just maybe, someone will be listening.